Chapter 31. "Remember what we discussed," Haber said as the children stuffed their few belongings, food rations, water, and the like into their travel packs. "Don't tell anyone who we are," Barry repeated from his middle bunk. "Or what we're doing here," Susie added. "Haber, then how are we going to figure out when my dad came through?" Petrick asked. "You children will let me do the inquiring," Haber said. "Once we've determined how to access the travel records, we can look the information up ourselves. Nobody has to know." "Won't they be suspicious anyway?" Susie asked. "I'm sure everyone here will be suspicious," Haber said, stopping his movements and looking at each of them. "Up to a price, at least. Everything has its price." "Yeah, about price," said Barry. "We don't have anything to sell." "We do," Haber replied, and Petrick looked at him in surprise, but Haber didn't elaborate. His body language, however, spoke for him when he clutched the pack that Petrick knew held several of his father's inventions. Clever android, Petrick thought. He'd planned ahead. "Until we find someone willing to trade," Haber continued, "we are a family traveling to the Outer Rim to escape the draft, just like everyone else. Understood?" The children nodded. Haber looked directly at Petrick, and Susie socked him in the shoulder for good measure. "Got it," Petrick said ruefully. They hoisted their packs, which were much heavier now that they were laden with more provisions than they'd initially left with. Haber had plundered the mess hall stores the night before, whipping up several dehydrated meals that wouldn't spoil and then vacuum sealing them. Susie had asked whether or not the captain would be upset if she found out, and Haber replied with a refrain similar to the one he was currently singing. "What someone doesn't know won't hurt them, or, more importantly, us." They were outside the ship moments later, and they took in the landing bay that surrounded them. It was empty, except for their ship, and it echoed the slovenly look of the outside of the station. Behind them was a rectangle open to space beyond, and an energy field could be seen crackling and flickering every few seconds. The only thing holding in the atmosphere the band of travelers was breathing. With each flicker, Petrick could have sworn he saw wisps of air get sucked out and instantly freeze solid. It was not a reassuring sight. One might also expect that there would be attendants from the station servicing the Red Robert, refueling, and the like, but the landing deck was empty, except for Balta, who'd opened up the cargo hold and could be heard barking some orders at Colossus about unloading Dedrin and Eris's belongings. The couple was still inside, Petrick guessed, but as soon as he had done so, he saw the two of them peek their heads out from the hold. Barry smiled and waved at them. Eris was holding something in her hands. "We wanted to wish you well," Dedrin said as they reached the group, "before we left for our transport." "We don't have much to offer you," said Eris, "but this is a Kuna gem from our home. Well, old province." She uncovered a beautiful, albeit small, gold-flaked, round, jade-colored stone. "It is meant to bring good luck." "We thought perhaps you could use it to find the information you were looking for," Dedrin said. "It should be quite valuable." Barry reached for the stone, and Eris plopped it into his round fingers with a large smile. Barry grinned and showed it to Haber, who was already shaking his head. "We cannot accept this," Haber said. "It is very kind." "Please," said Dedrin. "It is exceptionally bad form to let traveling guests leave without some sort of gift to aid them in their journey." "We have our own items for trade," Haber replied, again refusing the gift. "But thank you for the thought." "Why can't we keep it?" Barry asked, looking unpleasantly confused. "It's obviously something quite valuable to them," Haber answered, sounding strained, "and we've done nothing to deserve such a gift." "You heard them," Barry said back, "and it's so pretty." "Barry," Susie stomped her feet, "it'd be rude." "Nuh-uh, they said it would be rude not to keep it." "Barry, please return the stone to them," Haber commanded. "You're supposed to do what I say," Barry said, challenging him. "Remember? That's what you said. You have to do what your master says." "No, he has to do what Petrick says," Susie said, correcting him. Haber, Barry, and Susie all turned to Petrick. Petrick looked back at them, and then at Dedrin and Eris, who were looking equally uncomfortable. It took him a moment to realize that they were waiting for him to make the decision. for him to decide what should happen. "Well," said Susie. Petrick sucked in a breath. What to do? "I think," he started, and then the words tumbled out. "I think it's a lovely gift, and we are honored to be part of your province's tradition. Thank you." Dedrin and Eris beamed. "You are welcome," Eris said, and gave Petrick a hug. She then proceeded to hug Susie and Barry, and then Haber, which was one of the most hilariously awkward comings together of two bodies that Petrick had ever witnessed. Of all Haber's impressively programmed abilities, hugging seemed not to be one of them. Once it was all done, an idea occurred to Petrick. "Perhaps we can return the favor," he said, reaching into his pack. "We don't have much, but a meal, maybe? Cooked and dehydrated last night by—" "No, no, no," said Dedrin, getting the uncomfortable look on his face again. "It would be equally rude of us to accept a gift from travelers such as yourselves." "But you're travelers too," Barry said, starting to reach into his pack as well. He looked inside and rummaged around for a moment. What came out was a juice box. Barry looked at the juice box for a long time. Petrick realized he hadn't seen Barry sucking on one of those since they'd left Indikar. It was obviously the last one, and he'd obviously been saving it for a long time. Barry looked up at the couple and then back at the juice box, torn. His hesitation underscored just how precious it was to him. "We can't," Eris said to him, holding up a hand. "You can," said Barry after a long moment, and then he plopped his precious juice into her other hand. "It's not much, but we give it to you for your hospitality and to nourish you on your own journey." It was as serious as Petrick had ever seen Barry about anything, and Eris apparently picked up on that because she dropped her hand of refusal and smiled at him. "We are honored," she said. "Where's my juice box?" The voice came from the direction of the cargo hold, and Balta stepped out grimy and sweaty, full of sass. "It wasn't their hospitality, now was it?" she said in a decidedly mocking tone. "It was my ship you stowed away on. Shouldn't that be my juice box?" The group stood around awkwardly for a moment, unsure of what to do with Balta's question. It wasn't clear if she was serious, and she was butting into a conversation that hadn't planned on her presence. Barry, after a moment, went to grab the small box from Eris's hand with the intention of bringing it over to the captain. "Oh, stop," Balta said. "I'm only kidding. What am I going to do with a juice box? It's a stupid kid's present." And then she walked off. Petrick frowned, trying to figure out why Balta had even said anything in the first place then. Of course it was a kid's present. Barry was a kid. Why point that out? Unless for some unbelievable reason she actually did want a present? Or maybe she was just trying to make them all feel sorry for stealing onto her ship like they had? One last jab? Eventually, he shook his head and gave up. Barry went in for a hug with Eris, and she hugged him back. The rest of the group was content to nod and smile at each other. Then, Dedrin and Eris walked back into the hold with a small wave. "They are so nice," Barry said with a deep sigh. That left Haber, Petrick, Barry, Susie, and Clark all alone again. They looked once more at the hangar bay around them. A single exit lay across the way. Everyone re-shouldered their packs and set off toward it. They reached the hallway that led from the hangar bay, and the Red Robert receded from view as they entered. Petrick could see an immediate problem. The hall ran in two directions. Neither was marked, neither showed any activity of any kind to indicate what lay in that direction, and both stank of mildew and neglect. "Which way?" Petrick asked. Haber trailed off, looking at the walls around them for some indication of where they were. "I do not know." Behind them, a clanging sound came rumbling toward them, and they turned and saw Balta approaching in front of a rattling cart full of small metal containers, Colossus pushing it from behind. Petrick immediately recognized the cart's contents as Starstuff pods, empty ones, it looked like. "They must be kept in that fuel storage room I saw," he thought, remembering the only tour he'd been able to take of the Red Robert's core room. "Lost already?" Balta said in a not-so-subtly mocking tone. "I'd have figured the son of Fenton the Seeker would know his way around a measly space station." Petrick gritted his teeth. "We're looking for the marketplace facilities in Liberatia," Haber said. "They don't seem to be marked." It doesn't pay to mark things down when you're a station on the run from the authority, Balta grunted, and she wheeled past them, taking the corridor to the right-hand side. Are you going to the marketplace? Haber asked her as she rumbled away. The round captain didn't answer them. She just kept on walking with Colossus in tow. She's so rude, Susie snorted in disgust. Indeed, said Haber, using his responsive choice. However, I would think she should lead us right to the marketplace if we were to follow her. What makes you say that? Barry asked. Those are fuel pods, Petrick answered. She's going to buy Starstuff. The marketplace was a sea of Baltas, in all shapes and sizes, granted, but it overflowed with men and women with the same scowling faces, squinting glares, receding hairlines, and ruddy, oily-looking skin. They were an uncouth group of life-weary criminals, at least according to the authority, who said nobody could travel among the stars except those they gave their permission and collected their dues from. Our foursome stood out from the group dramatically. As the throngs of people strode past them, giving them glances, Petrick realized that his clothes were painfully simple. He'd never really noticed his clothing before now, a simple hand-woven tan tunic with long sleeves that he wore up or down, thick gray trousers with telltale brown dirt spots on the knees and cuffs, and a pair of plain leather shoes from the lab. What some of these other people were wearing, though, they were by no means any less worn or dirty, but they comparatively shone like the colors of the rainbow, golds and greens and reds and blues, all mixed with dirt, sweat, and grime. The longer our four stood at one of the many entranceways to the large chambered marketplace, the more they began to see other wide-eyed people milling about inside, some with similarly simple clothing. Petrick realized those fellow plainclothed people must be travelers, such as Dedran Daenerys, and such as himself to some extent, adrift among this rough crowd trying to reach the other side of the wall and start a new life, or find a long-lost one. Stay close, said Haber, and they waded into the throngs of people. The marketplace was haphazardly organized, to say the least. There were very few clearly delineated walkways, and proprietors were set up in little more than tents of varying size and sophistication. As the children walked tightly together behind their tall android companion, they passed by people buying and selling and haggling over trinkets, powders, food, engine parts, charts, drink. There were several makeshift bars, in fact, and anything else you could conceive of. Petrick nearly jumped out of his shirt when a holographic firework exploded right over his head. Susie did the same when a passing man smiled a toothless smile at her and mumbled something about her being very pretty. She linked arms with Petrick and Barry, so that now all three of them were physically connected to each other. Clark, meanwhile, was being very distractible, weaving among the people around them and sniffing interesting smells everywhere they went. It made Petrick nervous enough to snatch him up from the ground and hold him for the remainder of their search. They'd been walking aimlessly for some time when Haber finally stopped, and the children bumped into him from behind. They'd reached the center of the large room. It was hard to tell from the edges of the room what it had once been, but now, standing in the middle of it, Petrick realized it had clearly been a shipyard of some kind. He could see cranes folded up or broken along the walls, and on one far wall was a huge closed hangar door that conceivably led to space. The floor sloped gently toward that door, where a completed ship would have been rolled out into the vacuum beyond to take flight. The place ached with history. Its past was long forgotten in the hustle and bustle of this rowdy community as they jockeyed for financial gain, supplies, and pleasures before taking their leave of this temporary place. How grand the Gateway Station must have been in its heyday. Giant ships being built to ferry the millions of people that would need such a large ship to be built, to travel through one of the original gateways in the wall, of which there were now only one. Well, two, if you counted the one Liberatia had resurrected. The room was a silent monument to an age that had crumbled, and walking over those ruins, Petrick felt like an insect crawling over a colossal fallen corpse. Life doesn't simply end when a titan falls. It goes on, scurrying at its feet, waiting for another giant to rise someday. All of this was because of Starstuff. All of this was what Petrick's father had been trying to teach him, trying to save. Barry and Susie were knocked into violently by a rather small man who reeked of booze. Both would have been thrown to the ground if it were not for Haber's catching grasp. The man looked at them blearily once he righted himself and flashed a grotesquely yellow and black toothy smile. Haber stepped in between the man and the children. "Move along, sir," he said. "They bumped into me," the drunk replied, straightening up to face the android. He looked as if he were about to puff his chest out, or take a swing, or make some other drunken display of masculinity, but the impulse seemed to pass as another wave of intoxication hit him. He smiled at Haber and swayed. "You're tall," he said too loudly. Then, quickly as he'd come, he disappeared into the throng of people. Petrick breathed a sigh of relief and watched as Haber continued to scan the marketplace in all directions. "What are you looking for?" Petrick half shouted up toward him. "I'm unsure specifically," the android admitted, "but someone's selling information on the station, maps or means of transportation, something of that kind." "Can we sit down?" Barry asked. "Somewhere not in the crowd? These floors are hurting my feet." "Perhaps this is not the best method," Haber said, looking down at his small charges, standing shoulder to shoulder to ward off the throng around them. "Maybe we should just ask someone where we can find the information we want," Susie pointed out. "Are you seeing the same people I am?" Barry asked, looking at her like she was crazy. "They'd take our food and slit our throats in 5 seconds." Click. The foursome was blinded for a moment by a flash of bright light. "What information is it that you seek, travelers?" a voice called out from behind the light. The group blinked, and a tall, thin man about Haber's height was standing in a long, dark coat, holding a small black square. He was smiling a big smile. Too big. He extended a strong arm and produced a bony hand to shake in greeting. Haber took it cautiously. "Pardon me for the flash of my imager. My name is Heck," he said smoothly, slipping the black box into his coat. "I enjoy taking pictures of the many travelers we get through our little way station here. I hope you don't mind. If you like, I can provide you with a holostick of yourselves for a small fee." Haber waved off that notion and tried to extract himself from the handshake, but Heck continued. "I also peddle information. What is it you're seeking today?" "Habisham," Haber said in wary introduction, finally able to let go of Heck's hand. "Assistant and guardian to Petrick of Indikar." "Indikar?" Heck said, raising an eyebrow. "That's out on the fringe, is it not?" Haber shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, don't worry, stranger," Heck said, his big smile growing bigger. "No one on Liberatia cares where you're from." Haber opted to change the subject. "We are in need of the historical records facility on this station." Heck laughed a slight, unpleasant chortle. "The historical records facility," he got out. "Look around you. This is a pirate town. We don't keep records, except what we have up here." He tapped his skull and leaned forward close to Haber, giving him a big grin again. "I am your historical records facility." Being as close to Haber's face as he was, he squinted, looking him up and down. "You're synthetic." "I am." "Who built you? I've never seen an android quite like you. Very human-like. Menoch Corporation?" "I was privately built." "On Indikar?" "Yes." Haber, this time, was jostled by a passerby, and he nearly bumped heads with Heck. He looked down at the kids and then back up at the man offering them information. Heck read the android's body language. "Would you like to follow me to my tent?" he asked. "Humble as it is, it would be much more private." He was grinning his extra-wide smile again. Haber looked at him for a long moment, then nodded his head. "Yes," he said. "What sort of payment would you require for your records?" "It depends on who you're trying to find," Heck answered with a wink at Petrick. "But come, it will be much easier off the walkway here. I'm not far." Heck turned, and Haber gestured to the children that it was all right for them to follow. They started threading their way through the dense crowd, and they'd made it maybe 4 or 5 steps when Barry cried out. "Hey!" shouted Susie, noticing that Heck had clamped his bony fingers around Barry's arm. Heck looked back at her, and in a split second, Susie knew what was going to happen, what his intentions were with Barry. He was going to take him. She did the only thing she could think of. She bit his arm. Heck yelled and let go of Barry. In the press of people, Petrick and Haber found themselves an arm's length away, too far. Heck changed plans. He grabbed Susie's wild hair with his other hand, yanked her with him, and they were gone in the crowd. Awesome. I am going to take a little sip of water. The weather got dry here. I can definitely feel it in my voice. Let me check here just to make sure. Yep, everything's looking good. Awesome. All right. Chapter 32. Clark, safely wrapped in Petrick's arms, began barking furiously and tried to wrestle free to go after the kidnapped Susie. "Stop that man!" Haber yelled, pointing after him, but the crowd only looked back in confusion. In just the mere moment it had taken them to reach Barry, who stood stunned and holding his bruised arm, there was nothing left to see. They were gone. "Come on," said Petrick. He linked arms with both Haber and Barry and knifed them into the multitude of bodies after Susie. He held Clark tight in his hands, who was fighting desperately to escape. They slipped, pushed, and squeezed, going ever faster, but they were only met by the throng. Petrick listened desperately for her voice. "Susie!" he shouted. Nothing. They can't have gone far. His breath was starting to get ragged from the effort, like he was crawling his way through sand. Do you see anything? He asked Haber. "I do not," said Haber. He was scanning, back and forth, his lanky form putting him just above the heads of the crowd. "Wait!" A scream echoed through the cavernous room. It wasn't Susie's. Haber gripped Petrick and Barry's hands and urged them forward on a beeline. "Let me go!" Heck shouted as they burst into a small ring of people surrounded by the kidnapper. He was fully suspended up in the air, desperately and ineffectively wielding a knife. Petrick realized with surprise it was Colossus who was holding him off the ground. Balta was at her robot's side, red-faced with fury. "You tell him to let me go!" Heck demanded of the pirate captain. Balta strode around her cart, which was buried somewhat in the crowd. Petrick noticed people had stopped moving about them, their interest piqued by the distraction. The captain balled her fists and glared at the writhing man who wasn't smiling any longer. "Drop the knife," she commanded. "Susie?" "Susie?" called Haber, and sure enough, she popped out from behind Balta and ran over to them. "You are unharmed?" he asked, looking her over. "She okay, android?" Balta called to Haber, not taking her eyes off Heck. "She appears to be," Haber answered. Heck caught sight of them, and his face twisted. "You'd aid the son of a traitor?" He snarled to Balta and pointed the knife directly at Petrick. "Do you know who he is?" Petrick's stomach churned. "Drop the knife," Balta said again, stone cold. Heck dropped his knife. Balta nodded at Colossus. The robot released Heck, and he was gone in an instant, without another word, back into the crowd of people, who, for their part, collectively shrugged and moved on. Balta watched to make sure the kidnapper was gone, then turned to the group of four, her face twisted in anger. "You want to get yourselves killed?" she asked them furiously. "What did I tell you about this place?" The four looked among each other, then back at the captain of the Red Robert. "You didn't tell us anything," Susie said. "Yeah, that's right," chimed in Barry. "Well, what did you think you were going to find here?" Balta countered. "Daisies and puppies? Do you know who that man was? What he does to people?" "No, we do not," Haber answered. Balta wiped her forehead and appeared as though she was trying to calm herself down. "Heck is one of the slave traders in Liberatia, one of the many. He snatches kids just like you and sells them to whoever's willing to pay." "Were you following us?" Susie asked. Balta glared at her. "No, I was not at all. I just happened to be in, the right place at the right time. Lucky for you." Susie nodded, unconvinced. "Lucky for us." "We should inform the authorities," Haber said. "There are no authorities here," Balta hissed. "It's a pirate colony. You have to protect yourselves." That man would have slit Haber's throat and thrown you all on the first slave ship to Cygnus or Ganymede Prime or whatever horrible place those scum take children." "He said that he could help us find information," Barry said. "Yeah, well, they'll say anything they need to get you to come with them, won't they?" "A slit to my throat would fail to deactivate me," Haber said, apparently still stuck on Balta's gruesome point from the moment before. Balta was too frustrated to reply. She made a series of hand movements and grunts, but nothing of sense emerged from them. "That man called my father the traitor," Petrick said to Balta. The pirate captain didn't answer the implied question. Instead, she scanned the crowd back and forth. "You're not safe here." "That would seem to be obvious," the android answered. Balta sighed. "Come with me," she said. "I thought you didn't want to help us," Barry said to Balta as soon as they could hear each other again. She'd taken them and her cart out one of the side entrances to the marketplace, and the din was noticeably quieter as soon as they stepped into the corridor beyond. Petrick wondered if there was some sort of noise-canceling effect that was working here. He could imagine such a feature would have been useful, given the noise that the shipyard would have given off when it was operational all those years ago. "I'm not helping you," Balta barked back at her. "I don't help anyone except myself." "But you helped Dedrin and Eris?" Barry asked, looking genuinely confused. "They paid me, boy," she replied. She then turned to Haber. "Speaking of which, how did you think you were going to pay for information?" Haber patted his pack. "We have items of particular value," he answered. "Show me what you have. If it's sufficient, I'll take you to see Kronos, and you'll pay me for the time you spent on my ship and for my troubles here." "Who is Kronos?" Haber asked. Balta shook her head. "No, you show me, now." Haber looked down at Petrick, and he realized that the android was looking at him for confirmation that it was okay to take Balta's bargain. Petrick hesitated, simply because he wasn't sure if what Haber had packed had any real value out here. If not, they were on a collision course with the end of someone's patience. Balta seemed as good as anyone's, so Petrick nodded. "Well?" Balta asked of them. Haber set the satchel down on top of Balta's fuel pod cart. He began to pull out various items ranging in size and function, and Petrick knew they were some of the best. He flushed with gratitude for the android and his foresight. He'd chosen well. "Whoa," said Barry, taking in all the gadgetry. "Hands off, Master Barry," Haber slapped at him, and Barry yanked away his outstretched arm. "This device is an atom reorganizer," he said of the first smallish box. "It can create minerals and substances of virtually any kind using any raw material." He gestured to a second device, a small sphere. "This is a density and phase adjuster. It can raise or lower the density of whatever is inside its field of displacement at varying depths and ranges, to pass through a wall, say, or even to let light pass through you for hiding." "How does that work?" Barry asked, entranced. "We only see stuff because light bounces off it and reflects that light into our eyeballs," Petrick answered. "If light passes through an object, it might as well be invisible." "How do I know any of this stuff works?" Balta said, squinting and nodding at the objects laid out. Petrick stepped forward and grabbed the small sphere. Before Haber could stop him, he'd twisted its top, pressed a couple of buttons, and flipped a small switch. There was a crackling sound for an instant, and he disappeared. Barry gasped. Even Balta's mouth dropped open. With another crackle, Petrick flicked back into view, grinning. "My father designed it with an adjustable field radius," he said, saying proudly, "to encompass more than one person, if necessary." Balta held up her hand. "Okay," she said. These are devices of Fenton the Seeker's creation?" Haber nodded. "I want nothing to do with them," Balta said. Petrick was about to protest and ask for an explanation when Balta threw a hand up to stop him and added, "But Kronos may find them interesting." "Who is Kronos?" Petrick asked. "He's who you're looking for on this station," Balta said. "He knows where my dad went?" "Maybe, if you can get him to talk. He's not going to like you." "Does he like you?" Susie asked. "Nope," Balta answered. "But apparently He's also the only one right now who can fill these up. Balta gestured to the fuel pods. So, it all works out, doesn't it? Take another sip. Hope you're enjoying everything so far. It made sense in a network of domes and tunnels and connecting passageways that there would be some sort of rapid transit system to ferry people from one interior to another. What was actually remarkable was that some of it still worked. Balta had led them down a sloping hallway from the marketplace through several twists and turns, and they'd emerged at what she'd identified as the far side of Gateway Station. Ahead of them was a station platform of some kind, with a transparent wall that provided a wide view of the other side of the wall. "That's the outer rim out there," Balta said, pointing to the wilderness that stretched out beyond. Not that you could see much of it through the murky dust and rocks floating beyond the station, but it did still feel dangerous and exciting. The group's attention then moved to the platform that they were all standing on, which opened on both ends to a tube about 20 feet in circumference. If the children had ever seen one before, they would have thought it looked like a subway. Balta had chirped some words into a comm panel over at one end of the platform, and a few moments later, the air began to whoosh from the tube on the left side of the platform. A few moments after that, a transparent, enclosed carriage arrived, almost noiselessly, and its doors hissed open invitingly. Balta gestured for everyone to move inside. "This is all right," she said. They stepped inside, and Balta rumbled her cart in with them, Colossus right behind. Colossus stood with the cart, and the rest all took various seats in the carriage. The interior was musty, most likely an effect of the run-down-looking seats, which clearly hadn't been cleaned or replaced in who knew how long, and the floor, which was littered here and there with rubbish. But the completely transparent sides of the car clearly had been cleaned and maintained. That was fortunate, because a moment later, the doors behind our group shuffled closed, the carriage launched back into the tube from whence it had arrived, and a brand new, spectacular view of Gateway Station and the wall beyond opened up to them. The transport tube was transparent along its entire track. "Whoa!" Barry exclaimed. "Look at that!" He was pointing to the gate they were fast approaching. It was the one they'd seen when they'd first flown into Liberatia. In stark contrast to the gleaming Authority-maintained gateway, this one was falling apart in every direction in which one could look. Still, as they sped toward it in their tube carriage, its sheer size made it a sight to behold. As they approached the edge and their path led over the top curve of the circular gateway, they could see several large ships floating behind it. "That's Dedra Nenaris's colony ship," Balta said, pointing to a gigantic, lumpy, oval-shaped ship. It was dotted with more windows than Petrick had ever seen. "What about that one?" Barry asked, pointing to another, even larger ship. It was oddly marked and appeared to be well armed, with several gun-like protrusions poking out here and there. "That's a Tusian battleship," Balta answered, gazing with raised eyebrows. "I wasn't aware there were any left." "What do you mean?" Barry asked, wide-eyed, not taking his gaze off the starship. "Tusia went to war with the Authority almost 10 years ago. Rumor was that they were completely wiped out. Those rumors were not entirely accurate, it would seem." "People are going to war with the Authority?" Haber asked. "Whole planetary alliances, android," Balta confirmed. "Not everyone likes being told what they can and cannot do with their starstuff." The tube arced them over the rest of the gateway, and then they were plummeting down the other side. As Petrick watched the scenery rush past, he saw ruins of parks, gray and frozen from exposure to the vacuum, apartment towers with furniture still littering the rooms inside, huge sections of industrial carnage with twisting pipes and tanks. It looked like an entire civilization abandoned. All of this had been built to be used at one point, and now all that usefulness had been used up. Only the rotting shells were left behind as witnesses. "Where are we going?" Susie inquired. "I told you, to Kronos," Balta replied. "He's got his own setup on the station." Does the authority bug him? Petrick asked. Oh, I'm sure they would if they could, Balta answered. But he keeps moving too. Plenty of empty spaces around here. Petrick could see that. He looked out ahead as the tube reached a gentle crest and saw that the track stretched out almost to the vanishing point where things were too far distant to see. It went on for an inconceivably long distance. There must have been billions of people there at one point, on the edge of civilization and the wilderness. It was hard to imagine. The carriage began to slow after several more minutes. Looking back, Petrick could see the Liberatia gateway behind them. They hadn't actually gone that far, but far was now a relative term, wasn't it? It had been less than a week ago that anything beyond the Childers' Wall was enormously far and perilous. But he didn't have time to dwell on the thought of their expanding universe, because the carriage came to an abrupt stop, and the doors creaked open. You let me do the talking, Balta said, her voice tight and serious. An android that looked almost exactly like Colossus stood in the corridor beyond. It had the same bare metal skeleton with an unanthropomorphized face that glowed red. The robot clicked some unintelligible words to Balta, and the captain grunted and gestured for the children and Haber to follow. The corridor was as aged and dirty as they'd come to expect. They walked past a viewing window that looked out onto the rim side of the wall. Petrick could see tape crisscrossing the transparent material in several places, patching cracks and holes that would leak atmosphere. Tape. It was literally what was holding this part of the station together. It didn't bode well. Petrick realized, in fact, that he felt an uneasiness that was growing the further they went, following the android's clanking steps in front of them. He looked up at Balta for some indication of her stress level, but the ruddy captain was impassive, pushing her cart of fuel pods along. After a few more twists and turns, they finally reached a large metal door marked Computronics. Their android escort walked over to an access screen on the side and clicked some instructions to it. He then stood aside and looked at Balta, who walked up to the screen and cleared her throat. "It's me, Kronos," she said gruffly. "Let us in." "Who is us?" a voice squawked back from the screen. "I see you have tagalongs." "Just let me in, Bolt's brain. I have ore to trade." There was a brief pause, and then the door unlatched with a loud clank. The Colossus-esque robot grabbed hold of a corner of it and swung it open. The way it ground as it went, Petrick knew for certain it couldn't be opened by human strength alone. The chamber inside was a dome several stories high, and ringing the dome were banks and banks of computer casings with screens and control panels and levers and buttons. Lights flashed on only about a quarter of them, but it was enough to give the room a gold glow. Petrick wondered for a split second how anyone could possibly use the terminals that were off the ground, as the banks rose up toward the apex of the dome, easily 100 feet above them. But then he saw the network of cables dangling there, some still attached to the harnesses they had been designed for. When this room had been a beehive of computing activity, the operators had moved up and down, each attached to their own harness and a pair of cables. It must have been quite a sight. "Sweet, sweet Balta," a voice called out that was no less squawking in timbre than what they'd heard coming from the screen outside a moment before. "Still running errands of mercy, I see." The group looked up toward where the voice was coming from, and that was when they saw them moving. Several of them, in fact, crawling directly along the computer banks themselves. Androids with 6, sometimes 8 legs, moving like insects in a hive. The largest of them, with enormous black eyes and a tiny mouth through which to speak, was looking directly at them. He grabbed onto a cable and deftly slid down it toward the group of humans, the rest of his smaller brood following suit. They clanked to the floor and then skittered up toward the intruders in the manner that any creature with 6 legs might. When he reached them, Kronos, as Petrick rightly assumed, stood up on 2 of his legs and folded the other 2 pairs, peering at his visitors. His minions swarmed in front of him, sharp, pointy appendages out threateningly. They advanced a few steps and hissed. Petrick gulped. And that's the end of chapter 32. Good stuff, guys. Hopefully everything went okay with the stream. I know we had a problem with that yesterday. It looks like we're good, though. Yeah, awesome. Good stuff, you guys. It's today's Thursday, so I'll be back tomorrow. Same time, same place. Pick up right where we left off. See what this Kronos character is all about. So yeah, thank you guys so much for joining. And I will see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. See you then.